Week 13 in the NFL is over, and you need to see this because it's a surprisingly good week again on the waiver wire. And it becomes even more important when there's 6 teams on bye in week 14. Some of these players are available in your league and can be starters for you as soon as this week. And there's no other place to start by going back to old reliable. The guy at the beginning of the year that I was screaming from the rooftops in August to go ahead and add and stash just in case something was wrong with Christian McCaffrey, and then McCaffrey ends up missing the first 10 weeks of the season, and it looks like there's a decent chance McCaffrey's about to miss the final month of the season. Because on Sunday Night Football in the snow game against Buffalo, McCaffrey seemed to injure his knee. He ended up leaving the game, got ruled out pretty quickly, and it seems like it was a PCL injury. If it's a PCL strain, that is like at minimum 2 to 3 weeks, probably 4 to 6. McCaffrey's injury could be season ending. Now, if McCaffrey's injury isn't season ending, it's really most likely only like he's going to come back if the 49ers were to make the NFL playoffs, which right now does not seem like it's going to be the case at all. So in terms of fantasy, I don't expect him to be out there week 14. I don't expect him to be out there week 15, and I'd be really doubting him coming back in week 16, given his injury history this year. So that means that Jordan Mason is officially a league winner for you. If you already have him on your rosters, congrats, but he's available right now in over 60% of fantasy leagues. And let's just go back to the beginning of the year. The first 5 weeks of the season when Jordan Mason was healthy, he got injured in Thursday Night Football, hurt his shoulder in week 6 after having a nice start. And look at this right here. 80% of the snaps, 81%, 78. You can just go down 73, 64. He's seeing 77% of the rush attempts according to Fantasy Life during this time, 61% of the routes. He was just an absolute workhorse back. I mean, there was for the most part no other competition. Those first 5 weeks, Mason was leading the NFL in broken tackle rate and NFL or running back carries. So much so that he ended up becoming like a week in and week out top 10, maybe even top 5 running back. He gets a number 5 overall finish. The game logs according to Player Profiler. Another top 12 finish here. Oh, he only finishes 24th for you, but he gets 88 yards. You can keep scrolling here, right? He finishes 5th overall in the week. This is the week 6 game where he gets you 98 total yards in like 1.5 quarters of play, and then he has to come out of the game because of the shoulder injury. And then from there on out, he was kind of limited the next few weeks. They went on bye. McCaffrey came back. But for those first 5 to 6 weeks, he was a borderline top 5 running back in fantasy football. And this past week when McCaffrey left that game, McCaffrey was looking really good early on. So it really stinks if you were relying on him for a win this past week, and honestly, obviously down the stretch. But Mason then comes in, he sees 25 overall snaps. Isaac Correndo is another name to mention, the rookie. He sees 11 snaps. He scores a touchdown in this game, but it was the Mason show. It was Mason taking 13 carries for 78 yards in this snow game, right? It was a very nice outcome here on a yards per carry. Continued to be efficient. Correndo was there. He did have 4 carries. He did look good. He scored a touchdown late in that game as well, but for the most part, I think it's going to be exactly what we saw the first 5 weeks of the season, albeit a more banged up 49ers offensive line, a more banged up Brock Purdy and wide receiver room, so the offense isn't as good as it was to start the year, but it's still good enough for me to look at Jordan Mason and say whatever fab you have left. I don't care if it's $73. I don't care if you haven't spent a dime this year and you have $100. Congratulations. You now have a starting running back the rest of the season on your fantasy team, and not only a starting running back, one that's probably going to average close to 5 yards per touch on an offense that can still move the ball, especially with Purdy getting healthy. Go spend the rest of your fab on Jordan Mason. But if he's not available, you have another great wide receiver option on the waiver wire available in 80% of leagues right now, and that's Adam Thielen, who in week 13, we come out here, the Carolina Panthers offense continues to look good. Thielen comes out, he has 10 targets, you can see right here on PFF. Leads the way with 10 targets. But not only that, this was his second game back from injury. He had a really bad hamstring injury. For older players, it takes a while to come back, but in general, this was a hamstring injury that put him immediately on IR. He then missed a couple more weeks after that. So Thielen came back in week 12 in a tough matchup against the Chiefs, and he looked decent. He had 3 catches, 57 yards. He had a big catch early and a big catch late in this game. He puts up about 9 fantasy points, but then he comes back. He played like only 50% of the snaps in this one. He comes back this past week. He goes out there, he plays 51 snaps, runs 39 routes, still operating as the primary slot receiver, but he's out there a lot more on the field, and it leads to an even bigger day. He has the touchdown that gets them into overtime. He has a big catch late that would have set them up for a potential game-winning field goal in overtime, but they ended up fumbling. Chuba Hubbard fumbles, but you get 20 plus points out of Adam Thielen, and sure, this is maybe just like maybe this just popped up, but we have a recent history of Thielen with Bryce Young. Recall last season when Thielen was healthy and he was averaging 8.1 targets per game, which was borderline top 12 in the NFL. The first half of the season, he was a top 12 receiver in fantasy. Now, of course, Thielen is another year older. Thielen is coming off of this hamstring injury, but if for the final month of the season, the Panthers offense keeps trending in the right direction, Bryce Young keeps improving, Thielen looks like the number 1 receiver. Because here's his competition. Xavier Legette, yes, he's kind of been inconsistent, but Bryce Young hasn't gone his way in key situations in the red zone or third down. Jalen Coker's banged up. David Moore had a bunch of drops today. He's still getting targets, but they're short area targets. Thielen is the guy who out of the slot, in the middle of the field, in the red zone, on third down, is getting Bryce Young's targets. And Bryce Young has been been playing a lot better. I mean, this is arguably a career game for him. He puts up nearly 300 yards. He puts up over 300 total yards with his rushing, multiple touchdowns here. And now look, coming into this game, over the past month of the season, Bryce Young was the number 8 graded quarterback on PFF the past month. That was coming into this game. I guarantee once they update their data from this past week, because it's early Monday morning right now, Bryce Young might be a top 5 quarterback over the last 5 weeks in terms of overall play. Yes, he's quietly playing that well. When you look forward, the matchup this upcoming week against the Eagles isn't great, but Thielen works out of the slot. He'll avoid Quinion Mitchell. He'll have the best matchup in that game. And then it's nice spots at home against the Cowboys, at home against the Cardinals, bottom 10 secondaries, and then on the road against the Bucks in the fantasy championship. These Panthers wide receivers have a strong rest of season schedule, and it looks like Thielen is the one that you can start not only in week 14 with all the buys, but probably the rest of the season for many leagues. Now, quickly, I do want to point out Marquise Brown. We don't have to spend a lot of time here, but there was a report that kind of got just lost in the sauce a little bit because the game started. Hollywood Brown could return in week 16 or 17, has an appointment in week 15 for a final clearance. So this is a situation where he should be on your IR spot in your fantasy league, but he's available in like 70% of leagues. People just outright dropped him. Maybe they don't have IR spots. He's somebody that's just worth stashing right now if he's able to return in a few games. For obvious reasons, he's a talented wide receiver, and for the most part this year, like, there's been struggles. Hopkins is coming off of a good game, sure. Xavier Worthy's coming off of a better game for him, sure, against the Raiders, but it was the Raiders, and for the most part this season, there's been struggles with this wide receiver room. You look at the schedule for the Chiefs upcoming, if it was the fantasy postseason, a matchup against the Texans is as good as it gets right now. A bottom 5 secondary, top 5 in points allowed to wide receivers, and then in the fantasy championship, the Steelers is not a great matchup, but at that point, you're just trying to get there. That week 16 matchup against the Texans is enough if Hollywood is cleared in week 15 for me to just want to stash him right now. Now, before we get into the next receiver who's available in 90% of leagues, even though he just put up 100 yards, I got to tell you about the sponsor of our fantasy blueprint and this video, Vivid Picks. Because if you love fantasy sports or just enjoy making predictions like I do, then this app is for you. Because Vivid Picks makes it pretty simple to get in on the action. All you do is pick players, make your predictions, and then watch the game unfold. It is that easy. Now, they have a couple of different formats, the versus format and the more or less. I personally predominantly play the more or less. It's my favorite, and I think it could be yours as well. This is an entry I took for the Monday Night Football game tonight for week 13. Now, again, if you're watching this after the fact, there'll be options for all other sports, Thursday Night Football and the Sunday games. I took Jerry Jeudy for more than 57.5 yards. I think this team continues to throw nearly 40 times per game. Jeudy, the number 1 receiver without Tillman, and Bo Nix for less than 19.5 rushing yards. He's not running at all the past month because he's developed more as a passer in the pocket, so he's not running at all. He's averaging like 2 yards per game the past month. I think that continues in a tougher defensive line matchup against the Browns. Now, here's the cool part. If you're new to Vivid Picks, when you sign up and you use code SAL, you'll get a free deposit bonus up to $250, meaning if you put in $25, you get an extra $25 for free to play with. You put in $250, you get $250 for free to play with. So if you're ready to take advantage of this deposit bonus and start making some predictions today, download the Vivid Picks app now and use code SAL to get started. A big thank you to Vivid Picks for sponsoring the Fantasy Blueprint. Now let's get back into it. And that wide receiver who just put up 100 yards, believe it or not, is the second-year wide receiver out of Penn State for the Jaguars, and it's Parker Washington, who this past week, he had a nice game. He leads the team with 11 targets, ahead of Brian Thomas. He's clearly the wide receiver 2 on this team since Christian Kirk and Gabe Davis went down with season-ending injuries. His only other competition, as you can see right here on PFF, is Devin Duvernay, Tim Jones, Elijah Cooks. None of these guys are real competition, and that's why he was able to go out there and on a larger target volume, 6 catches, 103 yards, and a touchdown. Not only was it 6 catches for him, he could have had another 1 or 2 in this game. There were some bad throws, but he was making legit throws on the sideline after the catch, breaking tackles. He looked good. Now, the big question is going to be, Trevor Lawrence suffered a pretty gruesome concussion in this one. He's already dealing with a shoulder injury, might have even re-injured that on this hit, so it's probably going to be Mac Jones moving forward, at least for week 14, potentially the rest of the year. You can see right here, SportsMD Analysis, a Harvard-trained surgeon on Twitter. He comes out and he says, serious concussion here. He was fencing, which just kind of means, for the most part, I'm not a doctor, but his hand going up in the air, it kind of looks stiffened. Most likely out week 14, and Jacksonville might not be worth returning in 2024 since they're not contending for anything, and if he's going to return in like week 16, week 17, already banged up, what's the point? So Mac Jones comes into this game, and he goes for 235 yards, right, and basically a half a play. He goes for 2 touchdowns. Now, he didn't look good. He completed 20 of 32 passes. I would say he looked better than he did 2 or 3 weeks ago, and that makes sense because he already has 2 or 3 starts under his belt. They went into the bye week. He had more time to work with his starting receivers, but he still did miss some serious throws in this one. I mean, he missed a 60, 70-yard touchdown wide open. Brian Thomas overthrew him down the field at one point. Like, we can't have that consistently. But it was at least good to see that Mac Jones was able to produce. Like, this wasn't the other games when we were getting barely 150 or 130 yards. He actually put up enough production to allow not only Parker Washington to go for 25 plus points, but we had Brian Thomas go for about 20 in this one. Evan Ingram saw 8 targets, so everybody was able to get by. The matchups do get a little bit more difficult than this past week against the Texans. You'll have a matchup against the Titans, that's tough. Nice matchup against the Jets at home and the Raiders, and then the Titans again in the fantasy championship. So for this specific week, when there's a bunch of buys, the only reason I'm recommending Washington is because of the fact that there's 6 teams on bye in week 14, and you're going to need anything off the waivers. I think Washington can come in and get you 6 to 8 targets. Now, the streamer option that you want for week 14, and you're going to need a streamer in a lot of leagues. A lot of people will, at least this week with 6 teams on bye and a lot of important quarterbacks. We'll talk about those in a second, but it's going to be Tua. Tua, who is right now coming off of just this insane stretch. Let's look at his pass attempts since he's returned. 46, 40, 36. So that's over the past month. He's averaging over 40 pass attempts a game. 28, 28, and 38. Okay. Over this past month, they've gone to even more of a quick pass offense. We've seen Jonnu Smith obviously get involved because of this. Devon Achane continues to be a very strong wide receiver, or a pass-catching running back, I should say. He's operating as a wide receiver at times in the slot, and it's all because they've changed the offense to throw the ball quicker even more. And this has continued to lead to good Tua performances. Now, of course, against Green Bay, it was all in garbage time for the most part, but we'll take garbage time, right? If your defense wants to give up a lot of points, you want to go for 365 yards, multiple passing touchdowns, 28.2 points. He has all of his stars right now healthy in Tyreek Hill as much as he could be with the wrist. Jonnu Smith has emerged, Devon Achane, Jalen Waddle's starting to trend up. And the real reason why Tua is appealing is because this right here, I mean, look at all the guys you have on bye. Lamar Jackson obviously is going to be somebody that a lot of people have to replace. Even Bo Nix has been a borderline top 5 quarterback the past 5 weeks of the season. CJ Stroud, some people are still starting. Anthony Richardson has been somebody people have started the last couple of weeks. Jaden Daniels is a big one. Drake May maybe has been somebody you've been streaming. So at minimum, there's 3 legit quarterbacks, potentially 4 to 5 quarterbacks here that you need to replace. I think Tua is the best option on the majority of waiver wires right now. And not only does he have a fine matchup at home against the Jets this upcoming week, but then the rest of the season, you could continue to start him. He goes to the Texans, who allow top 5 passing production this year. He goes to the 49ers, who we just saw Josh Allen dominate them. It's not the same defense. Basically, every guy in that defensive line and defense in general is banged up. And then in the fantasy championship against the Browns, okay, maybe you find somebody else at that point. Maybe you don't even need Tua at that point, but I do think he has a nice rest of season schedule. If you've been streaming to this point, try and get aggressive on the fab budget. Like I have, I would say like $20-something left in a couple of my leagues, and I might unload the whole clip because you can't take it with you. And at this point, there's not many better options going to be available. Quickly, I want to touch on the Chargers backfield because J.K. Dobbins, we got word he's going to be put on IR. So basically, you could probably drop him in most fantasy leagues. He might come back week 17. He's eligible to return week 17 of the fantasy championships. So that's a maybe at that point. And will he even get his full workload? It's a big question. So in their first game without J.K. Dobbins, we see this split right here. Gus Edwards, 24 snaps, Kamani Vidal, the rookie, 12, and Hassan Haskins goes for 7. Now in this game, here is the backfield carries split. You get Gus Edwards for 6 carries, Kamani Vidal for 4. Hassan Haskins had 1 carry that he fumbled on. He operated as a fullback on a short yardage situation and fumbled. So basically the best run was for Kamani Vidal of 16 yards. Both guys basically averaging 5 yards per carry. So nothing too exciting here overall, but if I had to pick one of these guys, it's going to be the rookie in Kamani Vidal that actually has a chance to break out down the stretch. He has nice size at 213 pounds. You go over to his athletic testing according to Player Profiler. Great speed, 88th percentile speed, above average burst at 77th percentile, and agility 79th percentile. And this is a guy who produced, albeit at a weaker school in Troy, 1,600 rushing yards, led college football in 2023. You add in 200 receiving yards. He had almost 1,900 total yards. That's a guy that he can pass protect, which is rare for a rookie right out the jump. He can catch passes. He can break tackles. That's somebody who's just more exciting than a Gus Edwards that I want to have on my team for a potential breakout. Especially when you look at the upcoming schedule. Like a matchup against the Chiefs, they're probably on the road going to be trailing in this game, especially if for some reason they don't have Ladd McConkey. More on that in a second, who's dealing with a knee injury. But this is a game where I think Kamani Vidal comes on the field more, a better pass catcher than you're going to get out of Gus Edwards. And maybe that's the type of performance that can propel him forward into a nice matchup against the Bucs to continue to see more touches. So if you're trying to stash somebody right now from this backfield who can realistically see 10 touches next week during all the buys, it would be Kamani Vidal for me. Another running back that's at least worth mentioning right now until we see what happens with some of the injury reports is Sincere McCormick, because this past week there was no Alexander Mattison for the Raiders on Friday night, Black Friday against the Chiefs, and there was no Zamir White. So what do we get? We get Amir Abdullah still starting and seeing the majority of the snaps, 42, but McCormick actually got going a little bit in this one. He plays 26 snaps. Overall, that leads to this nice performance. 14 touches for 65 total yards. He averaged over 5 yards per touch. He outproduced per touch and overall Amir Abdullah, who saw almost twice as many snaps in this game. And for a little bit of a background on McCormick, he's a 2022 undrafted free agent, so he really just hasn't caught on these past couple of years anywhere. But his final year of college in 2021, nearly 1,500 yards, back-to-back seasons of nearly 1,500 yards. It was a smaller program at UTSA. Also a guy who can catch passes, 20-plus receptions in every year. So he's able to do these things, right? He has this ability, but the real question is going to come down to what is the availability of Alexander Mattison and Zamir White, the veterans here, especially Mattison, who was close to returning this past week. Zamir White is still not practicing. It seems like Mattison will return, but at that point, will they give Sincere McCormick, who seems to be their most productive running back over the past month or two, more touches? There's at least a chance that happens, and it's no guarantee that Mattison and or White return. So with these nice matchups against the Bucs, the Falcons, the Jaguars, and the Saints, I mean, this is a top 5 running back schedule the rest of the season. If you can catch fire with one of these Raiders backs, they could be a flex option, especially in week 14 with all the buys and a nice matchup against the Bucs. So I'm not starting Sincere McCormick next week unless I'm in a real bind, but if Alexander Mattison was to miss, I think I start him. Even if Zamir White's out there, I think they go with Sincere McCormick over White. Now, this next situation is, like we mentioned earlier, Ladd McConkey. You really have to track this one, because as of right now, he exited with a knee injury late in the game. It was like the final couple of plays, they were kneeling it down, so there's no reason for him to come back in. Limited availability. So far, all they said was that he's going to get an MRI on Monday. Currently, the comments suggest low severity. It seemed like he injured his knee earlier in the game. He was already battling the shoulder injury. He played through both of those, had a great game of like 9 catches over 100 yards, but we have to see the reports. Maybe by the time you're watching this, the reports are out and everything is fine. Hopefully they are. Because, I mean, this guy is everything for this team right now. You see his 12 targets right here from this past week. No other wide receiver was more than 4 with Quentin Johnston. Only one other player other than Quentin Johnston had more than 1 target, and it was a tight end, Stone Smart, who had 2 in this one. So, I mean, it was all day here, the Ladd McConkey show with 12 targets. So, if he was to miss time, well, now all the wide receivers start to come into play. Josh Palmer, who scored a touchdown in this game. Quentin Johnston, who continues to be number 2 in target share, even though he's had some drops. DJ Shark, who's returned from injury a couple of weeks now. He's starting to trend in the right direction. So, I don't want to start any of them. I would rank it Quentin Johnston, Palmer, and DJ Shark in that order if McConkey was out. If McConkey plays, I don't want any of these guys. Also got to continue to discuss Marquez Valdes-Scantling for a couple of different reasons, because this past week he goes out there, comes out of the bye week, leads the wide receivers in targets again with just 3, but he continues to get there on low volume. He scores another deep touchdown in this game, 28-yard touchdown. And the reason why it's important is this right here. Taysom Hill, high concern for knee ligament tear. Best case scenario is a bone bruise, still multiple week injury. He suspects, Sports MD analysis, that the season is over on Taysom Hill. Now, I say that because Taysom Hill has been the leading target earner and producer for this team. This past week, he had 7 targets. So now if he's out, they have to rely on their wide receivers even more. And with Chris Olave still out, it's really just MVS. If I pull up the sleeper game logs here, MVS in his 3 games now with the Saints has 26 points, 16, and 11.6 points. Again, he's not doing it on high volume. Literally right here, he's only getting 3 targets, 4 targets, and 3 targets, but he's somehow scoring on like every other one of his targets. That is not going to continue, but now maybe with Taysom Hill out, his role evolves a little bit more and more volume comes. We shall see. Got to talk about Dontavian Wicks. I mean, he didn't do a ton of good things. He got tackled on the 1-yard line on Thanksgiving. Otherwise, he would have had a little bit of a bigger day, but they play on Thursday Night Football this week. Romeo Doubs is still battling a concussion. There's a chance he is able to play in time for that game, but if he's not, Dontavian Wicks is somebody worth adding and playing in this game, in this week with 6 teams on bye. The Commanders backfield. This team does go on the bye, so it's not as important, but Brian Robinson returned from injury. He looked good. He put up 20 fantasy points. Jeremy McNichols did operate as the RB2 in this game. Now, you might look at the box scores and see Chris Rodriguez had a bunch of yards, had a touchdown. He looked like the RB2. He wasn't. He basically did not play the first 3 quarters of that game for the most part. It was McNichols, who was also looking good, averaging like 4 to 5 yards per touch. If you're going to stash one of these backups with Eckler basically done for the fantasy season, it would be McNichols. And then there's Nick Westbrook, who continues to just kind of be like, if you guys remember Allen Hurns, this was like 5 or 6 years ago for the Jaguars. He had like an 11 touchdown season, and he was basically doing the same thing. He would have like 2 or 3 catches in the game, and they were all touchdowns. But we actually saw a little bit of some evolution in Nick Westbrook's role this past week. He saw 7 targets, led the team, which was a season high in targets for him. That's good to see. It led to this nice performance. 3 catches, 61 yards, 2 touchdowns. Again, I mean, the touchdowns just continue to be the way. Let's look at his game logs here in Player Profiler. For the first month, he does absolutely nothing. And now since then, he's had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 touchdowns. You scroll even more, 2 more today. So he's had 8 touchdowns, I believe, in his past 8 games. This is obviously crazy that he's doing this. It is not sustainable, but for right now, he's on this hot stretch. And with a lot of teams on bye, I'm more interested in him because of the increased volume he saw. And obviously, if the touchdowns come again, great. Now, I will just call out that if you're still making a push for your fantasy playoffs or you're in the fantasy playoffs, you can get access to my rankings each week, projections, game notes, and waiver wire tools that are linked right here. There'll also be a QR code right now on the screen. It's my risk-free fantasy blueprint. You just follow those steps to get it. You can join the 21,000 other people that have access if you're interested, if you need even more help in the fantasy postseason. So these are the players that you need to be adding right now before your friends do and before that crazy week 14 bye-pocalypse comes in. I'll also have a players to stash video coming out tomorrow. That will pop up right here once it's out. But until then, appreciate you all a ton. Hit the subscribe button before you go, and I'll see you in the next one.